So thank you so much for having me. I am here to talk about supporting secondary survivors, and I would just like to invite you to ask questions as you have them, and just interrupt me as you want to, and then I will hold space at the end for more questions. But I am the director of mission services at Prevail. And I'll tell you a little bit about Prevail because I know a lot of us, work together. And wherever you are in your space might need a referral to an advocacy agency in Hamilton County. And we would be happy to be that for you. So we are an independent 501(c)(3), founded in 1986. So we're about ready to celebrate our 40th anniversary next year, which is exciting. We've served over 70,000 survivors, and we're dedicated to providing life-saving support to survivors of crime and abuse. We do provide supports to those in Hamilton County and neighboring counties. So you don't have to be exclusively a Hamilton County survivor, but maybe you live around the area. We absolutely can provide those services as well. We are the county's designated rape crisis center and domestic violence organization. We serve all humans starting at age 6 through adulthood at any point in their healing journey. And that's for any survivor that's been directly or indirectly impacted by crime and abuse. Our mission is to strive to empower victims of crime and abuse on their path to healing while engaging the community to support safe and healthy relationships. Okay, so I will move on to talk about a little bit about our services. And I'm going to be brief here, but we do provide 24-hour crisis response. We have a variety of support groups for children, adolescents, and adults. Boundary support groups, healthy relationships, general trauma groups, domestic abuse, sexual assault, lots of different groups that we provide, again, for those starting at age 6. And the groups are divided by age ranges as well. We provide individual appointments for clients that need that individual support, providing them psychoeducation, helping them understand a little bit more about their trauma experience. When I experience trauma, what happens in my brain and my body, and what do I do with that? What is a healthy relationship? Do I need to learn more about boundaries and how to be more assertive in my communication going forward? A lot of different tools and skills we onboard for those individuals that are interested in our services. We also do a lot of case management. So getting people connected to referrals and resources and working with them on self-sufficiency skills. So those basic financial skills that they might need, budgeting, understanding credit scores, building credit, getting connected to banking entities in our area, also working on resumes and those pre-employment skills like interviewing and understanding how to navigate those job boards and things like that. We offer court support. We do not have any attorneys on staff, but we're there to provide them emotional support, let them know who's going to be in the courtroom and what is their role, what to expect, set those realistic timelines for the judicial system, and try and get them connected with whether it's prosecutors or attorneys or law enforcement or what other types of systems they're involved with, kind of be that liaison and just help them walk through that process. Big part of what we do is safety planning. That's the core of our existence is safety planning, whether it's physical safety or emotional safety. We want to make sure that we're getting people to a space where they have a solid plan and feel a little bit safer in their environment. We also assist in helping folks understand what qualifies for a protection order, how to file that, and answer any questions around filing. So we assist in helping them file those petitions. And we do have a primary prevention program. So we have a team that is out in the schools in Hamilton County providing healthy relationship education, as well as having those seats at the table when we're making decisions for our community to provide safe and stable environments for our children. Research indicates that if the children feel safe and supported in their community, that they're less likely to be perpetrators of crime, and they're also less likely to be perpetrated against. So that's the primary prevention piece of that. The hope is that the abuse or the crimes don't happen in the first place. So that is the gist of what Prevail does. I invite you to reach out if you have questions about that, or if you are working with someone that might need those supports in our area. We are absolutely here to collaborate. So, like I said, we're going to be talking about secondary survivors. today. We are going to kind of unpack maybe what would be supportive for those secondary survivors and what are some pieces of information that might be helpful for them to understand, particularly when we're talking about parents who have children that have experienced abuse in some way. So, who is a secondary survivor? Those are individuals who are indirectly impacted by violence or trauma. So, you see, I have a picture there of kind of a rippling water effect. I like to think about it where we take a rock and we drop it into a pond, and there is a ripple effect. That rock is the trauma, and it ripples out and affects a lot of different people, and not just the individual that is directly impacted by this trauma. So that could be family members, including siblings who are often forgotten in this process, friends, colleagues, intimate partners, anyone that cares and loves this individual that has experienced trauma, crime, or abuse. And research indicates there's a profound emotional, psychological, and social effect for those secondary survivors. So it's important for us to support them. One thing I didn't mention about our services, which is ironic that I didn't, but we do provide support groups for parents of teens and children that have experienced sexual abuse. So I don't know if anyone that's on today is a parent. You certainly don't have to be a parent to support parents, but when you have children and your children have experienced harm, there is a healing journey for the parents. And their main focus usually is to make sure their child is healthy and whole, but in that, the process of healing and working on their own trauma experience is really, really helpful. So we do provide a support group for those parents and caregivers, and we also provide individual services for secondary survivors. But what I would love for you all to do is just take a second and put in the chat box one word describing how you might feel if someone you love disclosed trauma.
Okay, the first one we're seeing is guilt, concern, compassion, scared, sad, anger, helpless, anger, hurt, protective, all of the above.
Yeah. There's no wrong answer here, obviously. Any type of emotion that you might feel in this circumstance is valid for sure. And so that's a really important point when we are working with those secondary survivors to validate those feelings and normalize those feelings for them, just like we would for the primary survivor. And I joined in the discussion of the earlier session, and I'm loving the fact that there was a quiz in there and really envious that I didn't think of doing something like that. So next time I'm going to educate myself on how to put a Kahoot or whatever those quizzes are. My kids do those too. So I think that's fun, interactive way to engage your audience. So we're going to lower the standards a little bit for this presentation, but hopefully you'll get a lot out of it, and we can collaborate a little bit. Impacts of trauma on secondary survivor is pretty significant. So you see, I have some statistics here that 70% of secondary survivors report experiencing emotional distress, including anxiety, depression, and guilt. 30 to 50% of secondary survivors show symptoms of vicarious trauma or secondary traumatic stress, including intrusive thoughts, emotional numbing, and avoidance behaviors. Parents of child survivors of sexual abuse are at higher risk for PTSD and depression, with 34% meeting clinical criteria for post-traumatic stress. And 45% of secondary survivors supporting a loved one through trauma recovery report needing their own mental health services, but only 15% actually seek it out due to stigma or lack of resources. So those are pretty profound statistics, I think. And one thing that I think often comes up for our secondary survivor is maybe reactivating their own trauma. And it's really important for us to have a handle, as a secondary survivor, have a handle of our own trauma so that we're not then projecting that onto the primary survivor in that circumstance. And so we do a lot of work on that as well with our survivors. So many of you hit on these key points of common responses that our secondary survivors may feel, including compassion and empathy. Very important to feel those ways and to show that compassion and empathy to the survivor after they've disclosed. There may be shock or disbelief. As we know, a lot of perpetrators of these crimes and abuse are those that we trusted, that we know and that have an integral part in our lives. So we wouldn't necessarily think that these individuals would act in this way as a perpetrator of abuse and crime. Of course, there's guilt and shame. There's self-blame for not preventing the trauma or not recognizing the signs earlier. Common thoughts are, I should have done more. If only I had been there. Somebody had mentioned helplessness. They may struggle with the reality that they can't fix or erase this trauma. This happened, it's here, and now what do we do? I think many people, if we're going down the path of the secondary survivor being a parent, anytime a child is uncomfortable or is experiencing some pain in some way, we immediately wanted to take that away. And just like a broken arm, well, unless maybe we're a medical professional, but most of us aren't, especially on this call, where we're going to be able to make that go away or fix that. So that's something that we have to deal with and lean on other professionals to work on those types of things. Anger, big time. We could be angry at the perpetrator, of course, angry at the system or the survivor. That can happen sometimes. Some resentment could build up. That's a really difficult one for secondary survivors to express because there's, again, with that anger and resentment they're feeling, there's guilt about feeling that anger and resentment. And so we want to have a real safe, non-judgmental space to hold for these people to just say, yeah, I feel burdened and resentment right now that this person has experienced this trauma, and I don't know what to do with those emotions. And so we're there to help them work through that by first normalizing that and by acknowledging that that is a valid feeling to feel in that moment. And then what do we do about that, right? There's a lot of grief surrounding trauma. There's a lot of grief surrounding trauma of a secondary survivor as well. They're mourning the changes in intimacy, changes in trust and emotional connection that they may have felt to the survivor and the perpetrator. And that loss of the quote unquote before version of the person. There's a lot of innocence that could be lost in this experience, and we just don't want our loved ones to experience that. Some of the feelings may be trauma-like, so emotional numbing, those intrusive thoughts, hypervigilance, which could be also intrusive to the survivor, of us just really wanting to put that person in a bubble and protect them so that nothing else happens to them like what they've already experienced. And then we also have to talk about those maladaptive numbing behaviors. So sometimes those strategies are to use drugs, alcohol, or emotionally distancing ourselves. Additionally, we might want to seek revenge and really wanting to unpack how is that going to be helpful and what are some other maybe healthier strategies that we can onboard so that seeking revenge or those maladaptive coping strategies are minimized a little bit. We want to acknowledge them, but minimize, not having them at the top of our go-tos of our strategies going forward. It is very natural for us to want to ask the victim why. We want to open space for survivors to talk about their experience if they want to, but also giving them space to not have to talk about it and not have to answer our questions. And maybe they'll be ready at another time to do that, but really gauging what is going to be helpful for the survivor and where is that space for the secondary survivor to unpack some of those why did this happen and how did this happen. And that's, as advocates, what we can do. Therapists are really good in that space as well. And we as advocates can spend time on helping them with education to understand the why without offering those therapy modalities and staying in our lane. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. There's a lot of questions that parents ask after a child discloses. It's very natural to have questions, and it's important to spend time asking them. You might feel shame and fear about asking the questions. But again, that's what advocates are for, is to have a very safe, non-judgmental space to ask the questions. It's really important for us to remember when we're talking about, is my child telling the truth? It's important for us to remember that it's extremely rare for children to make false claims about sexual abuse. In fact, research shows that the vast majority of children who are disclosing abuse are telling the truth Children, especially younger ones, often lack the knowledge or the vocabulary to fabricate details about abuse. The best way that we can support a child or really a survivor overall is to believe them. So if the parent or the secondary survivor in this situation has doubts, as an advocate, hold space. What are those doubts? Where are they coming from? What are the, underlying concerns that you have right now? Let's flesh that out together, where we're not involving the child. Because like I said, the best way to support the child or the survivor is by believing them. Research indicates that the healing trajectory for a survivor really is impacted by those initial responses. So that could be first responders, that could be caregivers, that could be our loved ones, that could be advocates. Lots of different people can impact that healing trajectory. So a lot of times when I'm working with parents or caregivers or secondary survivors, the first thing I let them know when they're telling me that they believe their child, they believe their loved one, is to let them know by believing them and by getting them connected to supports and safety is already doing the best thing that they can do. And that is going to positively impact the healing journey for that individual. And you can see the relief immediately because they don't know what they're doing. And they don't know if they're causing more harm. And that's the absolute opposite of what they intend to do. And so we talk about, the intent over the impact, and that if they're doing these things already, they're already doing a remarkable job and they're supporting their loved one. Doubting their story can be harmful and may discourage them from sharing more. It's okay to have questions, like I said, and working with therapists or an advocate can help them process their feelings and prioritize their child's healing. So a lot of times when I'm working with people, they're like, I just really want to get the help for my child. I'll do the stuff for myself later. Well, helping your child is helping yourself right now. Helping your loved one is helping yourself right now. So we like to get advocates for the secondary survivor just as quickly as we do the primary survivor, so that everybody has their space and there isn't overlap on some of the confusion, some of those things that may not be helpful for the survivor to even hear. Another question that we get is, why did my child go along with the abuse? This is a painful but common question. It's really important to know that the child rarely goes along with abuse in the way that adults might think. Abusers are often manipulating, threatening, or using grooming tactics to confuse or control the child. Children may comply out of fear or think it's the thing that they need to do. It's out of confusion or even the desire to protect their loved ones. Additionally, children often don't recognize that what is happening is wrong or abusive, especially if the abuser is someone they trust. So it's helpful to remind yourself as the secondary survivor that your child did not consent. They're not of the age to consent, nor do they have the frontal lobe development to consent. They were coerced or manipulated. So going along with abuse isn't necessarily what we might think in the traditional terms of going along. Why did my child not tell me sooner? There are many reasons why children don't disclose right away or delay that disclosure. A lot of that comes from being afraid of being blamed or not believed, ashamed or confused by the experience. They might be protective of the abuser, which doesn't often make a lot of sense, except we know that the abuser is sometimes someone, and oftentimes someone that they care about. They're fearful of the consequences, not necessarily that they would be in trouble, although they might be fearful of being in trouble, but they may be fearful of what that's going to do to disrupt their life, their family dynamics, their friend dynamics, their daily. And that can be really scary and feel like it's all on them, that it's because of them that everything's turned upside down. We know as grown-ups that that's not the case, but children are often still in that developmental phase of being egocentric, not in a narcissistic, egocentric kind of way, but in that that's the way where their brain is in their developmental stages, is that you can tell a child, this is not about you, this is not your fault, but they're often going to go to, what did I do to cause this? Or how can I change this? And they don't have the power to do that. So there's a lot of confusion there. and they don't want to cause family conflict, even though they're not the perpetrator or the leader in this conflict that would be coming up. It's common for children to minimize or normalize what's happened, especially if they were groomed. It feels very normal that this happened because this person worked very diligently to make sure that the child felt like it was normal. And when the child does find the courage to tell you or to tell the caregiver or the safe person, that is that sign of trust and bravery, no matter what the timeline is. So it's really important as a person that might hear that disclosure, to let that child know, no matter what the circumstances, how brave and courageous they are to share that information with us today. And our job is to talk to them about safety and to get them the supports that they need. What if my child touches another child? It's understandable to worry about that, but it's also important to know that children who have been abused do not necessarily go on to harm others. However, if a child is exhibiting concerning behaviors that feel that it's outside of that developmental stage in their youth, it's essential to address that with them, to have compassion, but also not punishing them. So we could seek professional support from a therapist trained in trauma and child development. We can create a safe and open environment where the child feels comfortable discussing their feelings and boundaries. It's also important to set clear, consistent boundaries with healthy body safety rules, but avoid shaming and isolating the child. With the support, the child can heal and learn healthy ways to express themselves. We have a sexual assault response team in our county, as most counties do in our state, but we also have what we've have branched off to a child sexual assault response team. And one of the things we've been really focusing on right now is that child on child behavior and trying to understand what is at the root of that. Is that early exposure to sexually explicit images or content, because we have everything on our computers and our screens, and we can do our due diligence as caregivers to try to manage that, but oftentimes it's impossible to do? Or is that because the child has been unsafe in a different environment? And so we're working on tools and strategies to help those kiddos to not be in trouble if there are some maladaptive sexual behaviors that are happening. And seeking that professional guidance is really helpful to help the parents and caregivers through that. Should I treat my child differently now? Your child needs consistency, love, and support more than ever. It is natural to feel protective or uncertain, but maintaining familiar routines and expectations can be reassuring to them. So these are some things that we would have conversations with parents about, or caregivers or loved ones. So some helpful tips, is to be patient with changes in behavior. They may experience mood swings, regressions, or difficulties sleeping. We want to avoid being overprotective or isolating them. Again, that might reinforce some feelings of shame or make them feel different. We also want to provide opportunities for fun and normalcy while creating safe spaces to talk about their feelings when they're ready or if they want to. The child is the same person. They're more than their trauma. So we want to encourage the caregivers and loved ones to be consistent in offering love, stability, and patience. And that will help them feel safe and supported. Okay, so it is important to understand grooming because that is a component of abuse, really, for adults and children. Because oftentimes as adults, I hear a lot of, like, why would I even be in this relationship? Why would I trust this individual? Well, they don't start out that way. There's a big part of grooming that is building trust. And it begins with building trust between the abuser and the survivor, as well as the survivor's family and loved ones. The community can be groomed as well. So the abuser may present themselves as kind, helpful, or caring, often going out of their way to form a bond with children. Some of those techniques can include being overly attentive or interested in the child's life, offering gifts or special privileges or treats, spending one-on-one time with the individual, sometimes under the guise of mentorship or support. All of these things can be very normal behaviors, but it's taking it to that next level. And the intent is to build that trust so that they don't tell, so that they lower the individual's defenses, making them feel more vulnerable to manipulation. It also makes it harder for the child to recognize that it's even abuse in the first place, or the survivor, even as an adult, to recognize that it's abuse in the first place because it's coming from someone they trust and love or care about or look up to. Favoritism is another one. The key to a grooming tactic where the abuser singles out the individual, making them feel special or chosen. This creates a sense of loyalty and emotional dependence, especially if this person isn't recognized in a lot of different settings. Maybe they're a person that's more in the background or isn't as extroverted, if you will, the person that, talks a lot or is the one that brings a lot of energy to this space. Oftentimes, those individuals can be targeted because they're now getting attention that maybe they wouldn't get otherwise, or praise that they wouldn't get otherwise. The grooming is treating them differently than others, more privileges or rewards, making them feel indebted by doing favors or giving gifts. So this technique blurs boundaries and makes the child feel emotionally connected to the abuser, which can make it harder for them to recognize or disclose the abuse. Alienation is another one. Involves isolating the child from the person from their support system, making them more dependent on the abuser. By creating distance, the abuser limits the person's ability to seek help or recognize the situation as harmful. Some of these techniques include discouraging from the individual from confiding in others, criticizing or creating mistrust towards other safe individuals. So your parents don't understand, your friends don't get it, they don't like you like I do, they don't understand you in the way that I do. Physically isolating the child by arranging alone time is another way that this happens. Providing private outings so the individual feels special that they get to have these outings and do these special things with this individual, but all of it can be part of this grooming behavior and manipulating the person into feeling disconnected from trusted people and making it harder for them to seek help and recognize that abuse. Secrecy is at the hallmark of grooming. I always say that secrets are bad, surprises are fun. It can prevent an individual from telling anyone about the abuse. They often frame the abuse as a special secret or use threats or bribes or guilt to ensure the secrecy and silence continues. Some things they might say is, this is just between us. If you tell anyone, you'll get in trouble or no one will believe you. It's important for us to understand they're also normalizing inappropriate behavior as part of their special bond. By enforcing this secrecy, the abuser protects themselves and makes the individual feel complicit or too afraid to speak out. So what do survivors and their supports need? I've already mentioned that survivors need to feel a sense of belief. They need to feel supported. They need to have their supports understand some of the behaviors that they might be exhibiting as normal and that those are trauma responses, and not taking those things personally. And survivors need information. I often say survivors need information in bite-sized pieces. So really, we want to read the room, right? And understand what do they need in the moment and really understanding, are we giving them too much information? Noting that we might need to repeat this information or provide it verbally and in written documentation, but really just wanting to make sure that they are getting the information that they're seeking or really offering things that they don't even know that they might need. That is our role as the experts in this space. And then what do our secondary survivors need? Lots of different logistical things. This is something that's oftentimes overlooked because the abuse or the crime is usually perpetrated by someone they know. So a family member or a close friend or an intimate partner, and their world could be turned upside down. And that trickle-down effect that I talked about before, that rippling of the water, that's the same thing that happens when this disclosure happens for those caregivers or the secondary supports, that now safety is disrupted. Their housing might be on the line. Their financial security might be something that is up in the air that's related to the crime or the abuse. They might need to be taking time off of work that maybe they don't have to take. Maybe they don't have paid time off. that they're going to need to be there for potentially a forensic interview to get their child the support or their a loved one the support they need, maybe even just holding space for them. Maybe they need to stay home with this individual. So they might be losing some income. Their primary income might be coming from the person that is the perpetrator of this crime. And so there's lots of different things that can come up, including childcare. And then the explosion of potentially breaking up family dynamics, whether it's there's an offending parent involved or, step parent, or it's a family member that's in the household, or even those extended family members. Maybe they're not in household, but they're an integral part of the lives of these individuals. So we want to be very careful to understand that there's a lot of dynamics there that come into play. And as I mentioned before, there's a significant statistic of people that say that they need support, and a very small statistic of people that get the support they need. And so what are some of the barriers to getting support? Very much like a primary survivor here, we work with folks that are minimizing or downplaying their feelings, believing they shouldn't be seeking support because they weren't the ones directly harmed. They may feel guilt or shame for struggling emotionally altogether. That seeking support takes away from the survivor's needs, or maybe they're feeling like they're making it about them, which is not really the case. And we want to walk them through understanding that helping themselves, again, like I mentioned before, is in fact helping the primary survivor. Feeling like they're being a burden or fearing that they're a burden, they often downplay their feelings, believing they shouldn't be seeking the support. They weren't the ones directly being harmed. So again, there's that burden that they might be feeling like that they're putting out there as well, adding to the complexity of the trauma. Stigma and shame. They might feel worried about being judged or misunderstood. There's that parent guilt. As soon as you have a child, however you have a child come into your life, there's immediately guilt and shame. Whether or not anything's happened at all to that child, there's just always a guilt and shame involved with parenthood. And so when we now are adding that layer of trauma that has happened to your child, it just really impacts that level of guilt about not protecting your child. And there's also anger or confusion about the abuse, as we've mentioned before. There could be a lack of awareness of the available resources. They may not know what they're eligible for with supports, not understanding that, what if they are working with the Department of Child Services, what does that entail? That doesn't necessarily only entail there is some things that they need to do to meet the requirements of DCS, but there's also some resources that DCS has there. Same thing with our forensic interviewing or child advocacy centers. They try to help the families get connected to resources and help them understand what's out there. That's a big part of advocacy too, is to help our secondary survivors understand what is available to them. And so they don't miss out on that critical. They might feel, like we mentioned before, helpless and emotional exhaustion over not being able to fix the issue. Compassion fatigue is when we're absorbing emotional impact, anxiety, and hypervigilance. We might have those flashbacks and difficulty sleeping or concentrating. So a lot of that compassion fatigue comes up for our secondary survivors. Financially, the lack of insurance or underinsured, limited transportation, again, needing to transport your loved one to the professionals and meetings and all of the things that come with these traumatic experiences can take you away from your job, from your income, and having the lack of transportation. Maybe you don't have the access to a car or being able to get them to where they need to go. Childcare, time constraints due to other responsibilities. Oftentimes, there are other people that you're caring for and that you're taking care of that you have on your plate as well. It's not just this one thing that you can focus on all of the time. Trust and privacy concerns are a big thing. So they're worried about sharing their loved one's information without consent. Sometimes there's oversharing as well. I think that needs to be addressed, where we have to understand the primary survivor is the one that should be in the driver's seat about who knows their information. Now, when we're talking about children, obviously they don't have the same autonomy that adults would have. it is up to the survivor to make the decision about who do I want to know this information. Again, children, less autonomy. There are some, circumstances where we absolutely have to report and do different things. But does that mean that all the aunts and uncles need to know or that everyone at school needs to know? So we really want to be protective of that. But when we're talking about a secondary survivor, that trust and privacy worry can also come with feeling judged or misunderstood. And that's big. How didn't you know that this was happening? Or why didn't you do anything more to protect your child? Lots of times there's lots of judgment that comes along with these situations. They might find some difficulty with specialized supports. So again, as advocates, important for us to help them to get connected, help them understand what does their insurance cover if they do have insurance. If they don't, what are some of those resources that are out there that are maybe reduced rate or that have different like Good Samaritan programs that will cover the cost of things that they do. One thing I didn't mention about our services and many of the advocacy services throughout our state is that they're free and they're confidential. I think that's really important. Although we're not offering therapy, we are offering supports to help them get into those spaces, and everything that we do is free to get that warm handoff going there. So how can we support? First and foremost, we want to validate, we want to normalize their feelings. We want to let them know we believe them, want to let them know that what they're feeling is real. Normal emotions, body sensations to very abnormal situations. And it's really important that they feel that and that it's safe to talk about it in the context of advocacy appointments, therapy appointments. We want to make sure they have access to mental health providers. Research also suggests that involving a secondary survivor in some of the healing modalities can strengthen the relational bonds and improve coping, fosters empathy, reduces stigma, and promotes collective healing. And that's only if consent is given freely by the survivor, of course. But sometimes that co-regulation, and some of the engaging in the healing modalities can help. So at Prevail, we offer support groups to our youth, so our teen and our kids that have experienced sexual abuse. And it may coincide with the same time as the parents group or the caregivers group. They're as secondary survivors, but we would not engage them together without the consent of those children. And there are some activities that we do bring them together in the hopes that that would help them feel more bonded and maybe communicating a little bit better or more about their needs, their boundaries, and just expressing themselves in more of a healthy way. But that would never happen if there isn't consent or a level of comfort by the survivor. Peer support, very helpful. We've talked about this a lot, that there's a lot of disconnect that happens with the trauma and disconnect with people because they've broken trust. There's a fracture with what they thought were people that cared about them and supported them, but in turn, they've been abusing them. And so we also know that connection is healing. So putting people together to feel like, oh, I'm in a space where people get it without having to share what's happened to them directly, but really just, yeah, I understand that this group of people have gone through something difficult and I'm not alone here. And we onboard education and supports in that way. And it gives them a safe space to express their feelings, feel validated, and feel less isolated. Respite and self-care, always very important. Really onboarding what self-care is and how it doesn't have to be elaborate. It can be very simple. It can be done in your office. It can be done in your car. It can be done wherever you are, whenever you need it, and really onboarding some of those tools and skills to help them stay regulated. Because if you are dysregulated and activated and you are up here and you are trying to support another individual that's also up here, we're going nowhere. So we onboard a lot of skills about co-regulation, but also skills about how you can do that for yourself so that you can be in a space that you can be supportive. Advocacy is about helping navigate systems. So when somebody experiences trauma, they may be working with the school system, the judicial system, the medical system, DCS, child advocacy centers, you name it. lots of different systems that are very intricate. And if they haven't gone through this before, and hopefully they haven't, they may not know who the key players are. What do I expect next? How do I set up meetings? So helping them navigate those systems is a really big piece of advocating. We've already talked a little bit about the case management, getting them connected to those resources, whether it's financial supports, childcare, all of those different things. We really want to make sure that we're doing that. And providing psychoeducation to increase awareness of symptoms and effects of secondary trauma so that they can feel, again, validated in their experiences, be able to understand what's going on for their own traumatic experience so that they can then be supportive to their loved one. Psychoeducation includes emotional regulation, grounding techniques, self-care strategies, like I mentioned before. I also mentioned a little bit about exploring trauma, teaching primary and secondary survivors about what happens in our brain when we experience trauma can really help them understand their experiences. It can really normalize and validate why they responded in certain ways, why they continue to respond in certain ways, and how that affects their body. And their body gives them these sensations that they can start to name and normalize. And those are context clues to them to help them understand, oh, I'm feeling activated. What do I need to do to help myself get back to a regulated state, to help myself feel back into my comfort zone, back into that calm and collected state? And so we onboard those skills very early on so that they can then keep themselves as regulated as possible and really start to identify what are those triggers, what are those activation points, so that they can learn how to deal with those or avoid them altogether, depending on what we're talking about. A lot of skill building happens with psychoeducation. So establishing boundaries and how do I articulate those boundaries? Do I even know what's okay or not okay for me? And so exploring those different things. Communication skills, being able to say what we need, being able to identify what we need, and being able to communicate that in a healthy way. And then emotional vocabulary. Fully developed brain individual, sometimes it's hard to articulate how we feel or even be able to name it for ourselves. So imagine how that might be even more difficult if you are a child or adolescent that doesn't have that developed frontal lobe, that doesn't have that emotional vocabulary. So we build that vocabulary and help them understand that there are no bad emotions, but there may be emotions that are a little bit harder. So let's talk about that. And how do we learn that every emotion has its place and its purpose? And what do we do with that? Really important work that we do with all of our clients. And then, of course, healthy relationship education, helping them identify what's healthy, what's on that spectrum of, kind of leaning towards unhealthy, and then what might be labeled as abusive. So we work on understanding those dynamics and kind of outlining what are the relationships they have in their current lives and what relationships do they want to establish, whether it's peer-to-peer or family relationships or intimate partner relationships. It's just relationships in general. And understanding the shame and blame and stigma that goes along with, particularly with experiencing abuse. And so unpacking those deeper level emotions so they know what those are when they come up for them, and they can work on ways to understand the distortions that can come up and work on ways to fact check those distortions and get back into the reality of what is really happening versus what their mind's telling them might be happening, and be able to communicate about. So now I'm going to open it up for any questions or comments that you might have. I'd be happy to answer those.
Please feel free to unmute yourself or add any questions that you might have for Stephanie in the chat. And of course, we can always follow up if you have any specific questions that we don't have answers to right now today.
Hi, Stephanie. My name is
Hey.
Mallory. I work at a college, and so a lot of my situations are not parent-children. Not all the time. Sometimes they are. But a lot of mine is close friendship roommates, where their roommates are experiencing a situation or their best friend has experienced a situation. And then the second, I categorize them as a secondary survivor because they're so close to the situation. Do you have any recommendations on how to help individuals that aren't parents but are close to the situation?
Absolutely. Everything that I shared really does apply to any human that is supporting another individual. It's just a lot of what we do as far as secondary supports happens to be with parents. And I work with a lot of parents. So that's a lot of where my language comes from. But I think it's really important to, again, normalize those emotions, really validating, like, look, I know that this didn't happen to you and this happened to your roommate or your best friend, and that hurts you. And so when you're feeling those types of hurts, you are entitled to supports, and you are just as important to get that help. Whether you're even in the discussion about your friend or your roommate, you can be talking about yourself, and in no way, shape, or form is that selfish. That's actually selfless, so that you can take care of yourself. And so you're better equipped if your friend or your roommate needs to talk to you about something, knowing resources. And so that if you are in a circumstance where you can say, I'm so grateful that you trusted me to share this information. I know these resources on campus. I'll go with you. I can walk alongside you, and you don't have to do any of this alone. But in the meantime, the secondary survivor in that situation, I would want them to feel very empowered to know that they too deserve support and the education. And that can be sought out through advocacy. That can be sought out through supports through the school, or other groups that are available in the community.
Thank you.
Does
That
that
was
answer
helpful.
your question?
Yes, it does. It's like I shouldn't be
Okay.
treating them differently. They are entitled to the same, even if they're not the parent, not a family member. They are just as
Absolutely.
secondary victim. Yeah.
Well, and in all reality, as kids become teenagers up through their 20s, they're spending a majority of their time with their friends, with the roommate, with their peers. They're not spending as much time with parents. They might still spend a good quality time with their parents and things like that, but the peers turn into the people that they really rely on and influence them. And so if we can, I think it's always important, if we can educate all of them as to what supports are out there. God forbid something happens to you, but also God forbid something happens to you have those tools to be able to support them and to give them that information. And again, reminding them, like, look, you are still a young human that, that doesn't know everything. Right? Even as an old human, I don't know everything, but really just wanting them to understand that just because you aren't the parent or you aren't, the direct family member, that you are a very important part of that individual's life, and you can, be helpful, but also have boundaries. I think it's important to provide that boundary education. What is too much for that person to handle? And, how can they have conversations and the language around, I love you, or I care about you, and I want to make sure you get the help. I'm not bailing on you, and I'm not trying to let you down, but I do know that this person is trained to help you in this area. And I will go with you there if you want me to. I will sit outside the door if you want me to. We can continue to have discussions, but I'd also like for you to have a team. So just creating that language, for younger folks or anybody in your life that isn't necessarily the parent is really important.
Thank you. That was really helpful.
It's my pleasure. Always here to answer questions. If you all are working with survivors or their families or their friends and you're like, I didn't quite get this information from this presentation, I would love to know that so that I can continue to build it and make sure that I'm on point with what is needed out in our advocacy world. I do think it's important for everybody to have support.